if you have no guardrails at all, then people have long known throughout history, long before the concept of free speech, that lies will triumph over truth. Truth is slow, lies are fast, lies metastasize all the time.
Welcome to WONK. For most of human history, free speech was not a welcome concept. From protecting those in authority to maintaining a civil society, the notion that all ideas or expressions are equal is a pretty new one, and, it could be argued, a dangerous one. Fara Dabhoiwala is a senior research scholar in history at Princeton. His new book is What is Free Speech? The History of a Dangerous Idea. Thanks for being with us.
It's great to be on the show. Thank you, Amanda.
Let's start at the conclusion and work our way backwards. What is dangerous about free speech?
Well, free speech is dangerous in two ways. The first is the way that we all love and celebrate, and rightly so, and I count myself amongst those who believe strongly in free speech, and that is it's dangerous because it has the power to unsettle orthodoxy, to make people think in challenging ways, for the powerless, the voiceless to speak their truth to the more powerful. That's great. Throughout history, it's been used by women, by slaves, by all the downtrodden to advance their political causes. That's the good reason. The bad reason, as my book shows, is that unfortunately, free speech has always been something of a weaponized slogan. It's not really a completely coherent concept. That's why we can never agree on it. But it also means it's always from the outset been weaponized by the powerful, by the malicious, by people acting in bad faith as well as good faith. And the mess that we're in the world today is partly about that coming to a head in all sorts of ways in our current media world.
One of the things I should say, people should go and read your book. It's a wonderful history of how we arrived here. And I found it really instructive and fascinating. And there's one concept that I think is still very relevant today when we think about, well, okay, what are we going to do? And that's this concept that truth, in quotations, will find its way. So even if people, speak all kind of manner of different ideas, the true one will surface. And it almost seems quaint, I guess, but you imagine sort of the time of Plato, that, people sitting around and the truth would surface. Is that still kind of a concept we can cling to?
It's a really powerful concept that truth, in a battle between truth and lies, ultimately truth will be the victor. And it's put very beautifully by many theorists of free speech. You can think of John Milton, who writes a tract in the 17th century called Areopagitica, which is really the earliest English language expression of this as a statement of free speech. John Milton is actually not talking about free speech as we would think of it today. Part of the difficulty with this concept is it's very slippery. He's talking about religious free speech. And he's thinking that God ultimately is the only person who knows the answer, and that, if you're inspired spiritually, you will come closer to the truth because God will help you. That doesn't really apply anymore. So anyway, the rhetoric of it is powerful. Unfortunately, if you have no guardrails at all, then people have long known throughout history, long before the concept of free speech, that lies will triumph over truth. Truth is slow, lies are fast, lies metastasize all the time. In the Middle Ages, in the 16th and 17th centuries, people were very concerned with the spread of lies and untruth. The earliest laws about false news and things like that go right back to the Middle Ages. And so in the first age of free speech, which is the 18th century, people could see that even though the press, just like our online communications now, has speeded everything up and people believe that more information will lead to more truth, the same age-old wisdom still applies. Truth is slow, lies are fast. There's a great quote by Jonathan Swift, the 18th century journalist and writer, who said at one point, falsehood flies, falsehood is fast, falsehood flies and truth comes limping after it, like a man who's taught of a clever repartee long after the party's over. So, the same is true in our own world. That the difficulty is that there is a kernel of value in the idea that truth can out if you just let people discuss things freely. That's, for example, how scholarship works. It's how science works. But for that to work, you also need very good, strong guardrails against untruth. You need people to be acting in good faith. You need kind of peer review. You need collective decision making in order to weed out bad faith actors, weed out disinformation, weed out bullshit. And in the real world, in the online marketplace right now, that's exactly what we don't have. And that's why it doesn't work in general discourse right now.
And I'm going to come back to that, this idea that the places where we can most trust the veracity aren't free at all. They have real strictures around how you arrive at a conclusion. But I wanted to stay in the historical here for a second, because I actually was, this just speaks to, how rooted we become in our recent history. But I was struck by the extent to which historically, I don't know that you like the word censorship, but that the control of speech was really about making sure people didn't upset those in positions of power, whether that was the church or whether that was political figures, that you could literally be put to death for uttering what was considered slander against a monarch, for instance. And, we know that's true. We've seen evidence in history, but how that really kind of informed how people in the time dealt with speech. But then I want you to just note the parallel with today, with, the chairman of the Communications Commission in the U.S. tacitly removing comedians from the air. It feels very much like medieval Europe. Have we come kind of full circle on this, where people in power are no longer willing to accept the outcome, I guess, of free speech?
Well, people in power have always been very reluctant to accept the outcome of speech they don't agree with. And that's not a medieval kind of parallel. It's really all through history. If you look at the first age of free speech, people were very quick to notice that this is the 18th century when the first free press exists in England. They stop requiring controversial texts to be what they called licensed beforehand. They don't have to submit them to a censor. You can print what you like. You can be punished afterwards if it goes too far. But they call that the free press. And in this first age of the liberty of the press, people are very aware that this is a very subjective judgment. Liberty of the press is good, everyone agrees. Licentiousness, which is abuse of the press, everyone agrees is bad. But exactly where you draw that line is obviously a matter of subjective interpretation. And that's one reason why early on people couldn't theorize free speech very clearly. They knew it was about power. They knew that opposition politicians, whenever they were out of power and trying to gain public support, would endlessly champion the liberty of the press and the freedom of expression. And the moment they got into power, they turned into the worst censors, just like Trump, just like any other strongman today. So it's really an inheritance that is part of our modern world. If you go back before that, you're right that before the 18th century, people put a huge amount of effort into regulating speech. And a lot of that was done for reasons we no longer would agree with. For example, that society is incredibly hierarchical and you must never speak ill of those above you, and people above you have power to silence you just because they're above you. But the thing is, that's not just a top-down imposition, this way of thinking about speech and the need to regulate it. It's also informed by ordinary people going around all the time trying to guard their reputations against slander and lies by other people. And it's informed by some timeless truths that still hold true today. And two of those are especially important. The first is that everyone in the past knew and recognized that speech is not separate from action. Free speech theories now, the harder they are, the more they try and separate on the one hand speech, on the other hand action. Speech is an action. The great Enlightenment polemicist and writer Voltaire once said, "I write in order to act." And that's what all of us do who write. All of us who speak do so to have effects in the world, whether it's just talking to your children or broadcasting to the nation. Its communication is to influence other people. So that's the first thing they knew. And the second thing they knew is that although mainly it's a trivial act, it's a harmless, a fleeting act, sometimes speech can cause harm in the world, especially if it's repeated speech and especially if it's untrue. So they were very focused on the dangers of lies and conspiracy theories and, libels of entire groups. And for good reason. If you look at the historical record, time and time again, the spread of untruth and conspiracy theory and racist lies or religiously inspired invective leads to riots and bloodshed and pogroms and a political upheaval and the worst kind of human behavior. So those are true things. And the problem with the modern attempt to theorize free speech just as an individual right is that it has to kind of downplay the fact that speech can cause harm in the world and to downplay how you might deal with that. So the American attitude is just, oh, well, even if it causes harm, we just need more speech. And there, behind that lies the idea that truth will ultimately out. And that is also not true, unfortunately. So there's a whole series of presumptions that we jump to, but are really too simplistic for the complexity of what we're dealing with.
The American approach, the First Amendment, is, as you note in the book, I think it's one that really does inform how the rest of the Western world behaves. So it's important to look at it. And that description of how free speech will be governed in that country is really unadorned. It's really simple. And of course, sometimes that can be a wonderful thing, and sometimes that can be a terrible thing. Is it overly simple or simplistic, I guess, in its description of what free speech will be? It certainly doesn't address, Farah, the idea that speech is action or could be considered action.
Yes. I mean, this is a major theme in my book, as you know, the history of the First Amendment, the curious, twisted, misunderstood history of the First Amendment. It is too simplistic. It is it's the product of a particular rhetorical culture, an English rhetorical culture that goes back to the early 18th century attempt to create a simple theory of free speech. But as I show in my book, that is a very corrupt, actually, set of presumptions that are full of holes. So let me explain. In the earliest 18th century understanding of free speech, there's this balance between liberty and license, between the right to speak and the harms that you should not impose on other people. Your liberty is bounded by the liberty of other people. And out of that comes this balancing idea that everyone should have a right, but it's balanced by the responsibility to not to abuse it. The problem with that is once you start to look at it, as I said, it's subjective. It's also incredibly complicated. One person saying something is not necessarily the same as another person saying it. Me saying something horrible and libelous in a bar late at night to my friends is completely different from the President of the United States going on international media and saying it over and over again. So it's never just about the words. The difficulty is laws can't take account of all this very well. Laws are predicated on, simplicity, transparency, consistency, individual rights. And so what you end up with if you have a balancing approach in the law is endless inconsistencies and apparent hypocrisies and people being treated differently. It's a mess and everyone hates it. Everyone wants more simplicity. In the 18th century, two journalists developed this alternative theory, which is the origin of the absolutist theory, which says things like liberty of speech is the foundation of all liberty. The people are always right when they're left free to decide things for themselves. Governments are always out to tyrannize the people and grab more power for the governors. And so the moment you see any imposition on free speech, you're on a slippery slope to tyranny. This is a self-interested polemic put forward in the early 18th century by two London journalists who were just justifying their own muckraking attacks on the government. But it becomes very influential in North America when they rebel against their tyrannical governors and have the revolution. And so that absolutist language goes into the First Amendment in 1789. But even in America, one of the extraordinary discoveries I made in my book was that in 1789, at the very moment that they're deciding this language, which is not meant to be absolutist, actually, let's be clear about that. They're saying liberty is good. Everyone knows licentiousness is bad. They just don't write that in the law. It's a statement just about the federal government. Anyway, at the same time, in France, they're discussing and debating and finalizing their Declaration of Rights the same few months in 1789. And they're very closely in contact with each other about the form of these declarations. So the difficulty is they don't have email, they don't have telephones. The post takes 6 weeks to go back and forth. And so the Americans finish first and they're unable to take on board what the French come up with. The French come up with a completely different formulation. Every citizen has the right to freedom of expression, very important, but that's limited by the responsibility not to abuse it. And the interesting thing no one's ever noticed is when this news reaches America in 1789, all Americans read this in the newspaper and say, this is a much superior way of describing freedom of speech and the real difficulties it causes with untruth and libel and slander and so on. And we should adopt that version. And they do. And every single state constitution from 1789 onwards incorporates exactly those terms and a lot of kind of additional refinements to make sure that this is just, for example, about public speech, about public affairs, and it should be truthful and it shouldn't slander private individuals, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look at the real history of American free speech from 1789 all the way to the 1960s, it actually takes a very similar balancing approach to the rest of the world. It's only quite recently that Americans have veered away on this more libertarian trajectory, thinking that the text of the First Amendment is so simple, must mean that, no law will suffice. And the founders are so wise, they knew this all along. It's not true.
And as you say, easier to weaponize in its simplicity.
Much
and
easier.
Certainly has been done so. And again, if there's a learning from your book and this rich history of this subject, it's that weaponization has been the norm, not the exception when it comes to both free speech and its various forms of censorship. I guess I want to talk about sort of the evolution of this. It seems to have been going in one direction for now, really, certainly since those two journalists, Cato's letters. We've gone in this direction toward more freedom of speech, arguably, with pockets of difference. Is that an inevitable progression? I mean, is there only one direction? Is it more and more and more, or will there be a reversion in your view when we think about
endless
where we
reversions
are?
all the time. I mean, so at one level, if you take a global view of free speech just being about what you can talk about freely, then in the Western world, there's clearly been a huge and welcome expansion in the kinds of topics that people are allowed to speak freely about and debate without getting into trouble. Religious speech in many countries in Europe from the 18th century onwards is, restricted. Blasphemy is a real crime across the Western world in various ways. Speech critical of monarchies and governors and so on, sedition, laws against that. It's all, the sphere of free speech has been expanded in a good way. Sexual speech as well, prosecutions for obscenity and so on. But at a different level, as my book shows, it's never just about the content. It's also about who's speaking, the public good, many other considerations come into it. And even just now, talking to you in the United States, there's a huge effort by the current authoritarian administration to trample and suppress voices that it disagrees with, ideas that it doesn't like, even if those ideas are true and widely accepted in the rest of the world, like there is a climate crisis and the burning of fossil fuels is causing this, or women and black people are equally intelligent as white men. All these ideas about diversity, about climate, whatever, they are politicized. And currently, really in America, we're living through what people have called, I think rightly, a third Red Scare, where certain kinds of voices, certain kinds of ideas, talk about Gaza, talk about, the free speech of students, especially students of color. Those are being determined from the government in a top-down way as beyond the pale and censored as hard as the government can do with its powers, which are considerable. And the irony is that the First Amendment in its modern form actually has many valuable protections for especially politically dissenting speech. That's one of the good outcomes of this absolutist approach. And that those evolved in the 19-teens and 20s and then again in the 1950s as a reaction against exactly this kind of government censorship of communist and progressive voices then. This time it's much worse because the current administration is not just suppressing those voices and ideas, it's also going after, as authoritarian governments love to do, trying to shut down all independent sources of authority. And, notions that truth can be available elsewhere, not just in tweets from the White House. So science, universities, lawyers, judges, all these things. So this is also about how free speech is weaponized, because at the same time, of course, they're shouting at the tops of their lungs that they stand for free speech in a way that's, bringing back great American traditions and overturning the supposed censorship of their political opponents.
I want to dig into some of that. Slight aside, but one place where I think we've tried to meet the limits of free speech is with so-called hate speech laws. Do they come close to what they need to do? In allowing expression, but understanding that there's a limit. Where I guess that comes quite close to the speech is action notion. Is that one area where we've approached a decent trade-off?
Do you know what? This is a perennial problem which is insoluble in a perfect way. There are three models in the world, as I outline in my book, and they all have come about for different historically contingent reasons. The worst model is what you see in places that used to be under British rule in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and other former colonies, where in imperial times they put in place these laws that are now being taken over by the post-colonial states that incentivize people to use the law to prosecute things that offend them or, that are simply about religious offense. I'm hurt by someone else saying something about my religion, and so I'm going to wield the state's apparatus and the law to punish them. That's a terrible model. You never want to be in that camp. On the other hand, you have the American model now, which is that harm simply has to be allowed for, and that you can celebrate the genocide of Jews or, call for the murder of other people, as long as you're not directly calling for a specific person to be murdered and they then are subject to violence. The cause and effect is lost, and that First Amendment law protects you. And that's a really problematic approach too, because not because there are better ways, I'll come to the third way in a minute, but because it then incentivizes the idea that this is harmless and that more speech is the answer. And in fact, what we see online, especially now, is the metastasizing of all sorts of really horrible, violent hate mongering of a kind that, people in the 1930s were very concerned with. And out of that came the final model, which actually in America, it starts actually before the 1930s. It starts with black people in America, Jews in America, reacting against lynchings and mass murders and saying, look, libeling entire groups of people, they call this group libel, not hate speech. Group libel is a dangerous thing in the world. And in the 1930s, people can see what is happening in Europe. They can see the power of propaganda, racist propaganda, and how that leads to civic distrust and disorder and murder. And they say, no, we should draw the line at this. And out of that come experiments with what we now call hate speech legislation. I don't know if it's the best approach. But the danger is whenever you make a law, that the law will be interpreted in ways that you don't necessarily approve of, or that the lawmakers don't have any interest originally in creating. For example, Race Relations Act in England leads to the prosecution of disproportionate prosecution of black people who are criticizing white British racism. That is a problematic outcome. And the other problem with making laws is that you then create martyrs for free speech. People start pushing against the boundaries of the law to see how far they can go. This again is going on in England now, and it's a very tricky balance to strike. On the whole, I think it's right for societies to say, look, there are groups in our society that suffer disproportionately from discrimination and that are less powerful in our society, that deserve the protection of the state to uphold their equal dignity. That's what it's about, that these groups have equal dignity as citizens. They cannot just be slandered and reduced to subhuman or less human people in our political discourse. That's what it's about.
I want to talk about the places where truth does actually find support. These very organized places, rules-based places. So we mentioned some of them, academia, science, of course. You seem very mistrustful, that's a kind word, of journalism in the book, of the history of journalism.
I'm not mistrustful of journalism at all, but I'll let you finish and then I'll explain what I mean.
Well, or maybe just the sort of for-profit element and the degree to which journalism can be misappropriated by people for their own use. I guess, so with that framing, and maybe it's unfair and you have to recharacterize, my question is, could journalism not be lumped into that? Should it not be lumped into that category? And how do we get it back there? It isn't there now. We've lost the trust. We've lost the faith for very good reasons, by the way. And I'm not saying it's all slander. But to me, you should be able to say, that proper journalism, whatever that is, however we decide that, is the same as an academic journal and you can trust it. How do we get there?
I'm just going to say to your listeners and viewers, it is there in the book. I do say that, Amanda. But more seriously, let me take you through this a little bit historically. So, from the 19th century onwards, the first age of excitement about press liberty leading to enlightenment is an Enlightenment idea. People by and large think of the press, which is the mass medium technology of the 18th century, as an engine of enlightenment, that it will progress, that it will allow people to discuss everything more freely, and out of that free discussion will come greater understanding and progress towards the truth. And that's a very old idea, actually. That's one of the oldest ideas of free speech. It's the idea of scholarly free speech, libertas philosophandi, that if you have a really hard problem, then the best thing is to allow scholars freedom of inquiry and freedom of debate with each other across national and international boundaries. And so collectively, the Republic of Letters will advance a greater understanding of whatever the hard problem is. That's how universities work. That's how they still work. But as we've discussed already, there are very clear protocols that allow you to achieve that end. You need not to be bullshitting. You need to have evidence, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so people thought this was a good model. Then in the 19th century, they start to see that actually the mass media of the day are not very well set up to create truth and enlightenment and public understanding. That's not their incentive. Their incentive is to sell advertising and to make money for their owners and to create political power for their owners. And out of that comes a very intelligent critique of the mass media and of concepts of free speech that focuses on how we need the mass media, how we need to regulate or incentivize the mass media also to provide truthful information for citizens, especially in the public sphere. That's the core of our modern idea of free speech. And even in America, that becomes a really mainstream concern by the 1930s and 1940s. So if you look at the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which is drawn up in the early 40s by Eleanor Roosevelt and other Americans and, many other people, but it's also an American document. It defines the right to speech as very important. Free speech is very important. It's a right. It's also a responsibility. It's a balanced thing. But it includes the phrase, the right to truthful information. Citizens have the right to truthful information. And that's their expression of this push to make the media more responsible for this vital function that they have. And every mass medium other than the press had always been seen in that light, including in America, so that the radio and film and broadcasting always is regulated at arm's length by these bodies like the FCC in the public interest, so that you can't just use it, this propaganda tool, to spread lies willy-nilly. Right. Anyway, this actually leads to also experiments in public broadcasting, in other forms of news gathering that are not just capitalist money-making enterprises, subscription models, etc. So a lot of interesting things come out of it, including the responsibility that American and North American and Western broadcasters themselves take on increasingly seriously by the late 20th century of fact-checking, making corrections, doing investigative work seriously, and responsibility to the public to tell them the truth. That's a really important part, and sadly, American news organizations in the vanguard of this until the internet revolution. And the last part of my book is how the internet revolution has destroyed this. And partly that's informed by this very simplistic notion of free speech and of, the truth will come out if you just let everything just go. So yes, absolutely. Good journalism does that. Good journalism online still does that. The problem is we've moved as a society to a place where, first of all, we don't recognize that these giant corporations that now dominate online discourse are publishers, and we should treat them as publishers and hold them responsible for their great power in the world and in shaping public opinion. And that means, for example, their power over truth in political discourse. And secondly, we're enthralled to these simplistic notions that, free speech is great and the more of it, the better. And censorship is always bad and regulation is always censorship. And these companies are laughing because, it suits them very well not to moderate, to hold the standard of free speech and then to make giant amounts of money profiteering off misinformation and bullshit.
There's something very liberating for a lot of media about the idea that all news is fake news and nothing needs to be true or real.
Yeah.
It just frees people to say and do, as you say, whatever they want for whatever their aims might be. One thing that I really do want you to convey to people is whether you're optimistic about whether this can be, I'm not just talking about media here, I'm talking more broadly, whether any of this can be reversed. And reversed might not be the right word. You might not like that word.
No.
But developed in a way that gets us to a finer place. And I want to one thing really jumped out at me, which is this quote from Montaigne from 1580, where he said, "Truth for us nowadays is not what is, but what others can be brought to accept." 1580. And so, the more we change, I just wondered whether you have optimism and what it takes.
I have a small amount of optimism. I mean, information warfare is not new. I mean, it goes right back through recorded history. You can find it in the 17th century in very sophisticated forms. So the first thing is, as societies, we need to wake up and smell the coffee and realize that this is happening. Many people do, of course. The second thing is, the moment you start talking about this as censorship, you've lost the battle. We need to start thinking in more sophisticated terms about power and about freedom of speech being also about the interest, the public interest and the common good. And what is free speech for? One of the difficulties with online discourse is that it merges together all sorts of different kinds of speech. Artistic speech, for example, the work of writers and artists and comedians deserves free speech. Freedom of expression is very important in those spheres, but it's a different kind of freedom of expression from political speech. In the first case, for example, the literal truth is really not the point. Comedy is not about the literal truth. You make it up as you go along. You subvert the truth for fun. Everyone sees that, there are other ends there. In political speech, truth is really very important. If you allow truth and lies to be equivalent in your political discourse, we're back with what Swift said, the lies will win every time. If you allow bad faith interlocutors without any evidence to just, be treated on the par with people talking seriously, bringing facts to bear, it's not going to work. So that's one problem with online speech. We need platforms to take that more seriously. And the final point is really simply that, and this is where my optimism comes in, if we as societies are able to take account of the enormous power of these corporations in shaping political and public discourse, we need to come up with laws that will make them more responsible. The Europeans are doing that. The Brazilians are doing that. These are really minimal steps, but they are what we need. And all they're trying to do is to say to these corporations, you are publishers. That brings you great power and great wealth. And with that should come great responsibility, just like mass media in the past understood that to be the case. And they're trying to do things like simply have platforms be transparent about their algorithms. How do they work? What are they amplifying? What are they suppressing? They are the biggest censors of all. They are constantly amplifying certain voices and messages and suppressing others. We need transparency as societies about how this is happening. We need certainty about the consistency of application of these rules. And then finally, we need to, not just trust, but also verify, to use a historical American statement, as President Reagan said about nuclear arms. Trust but verify. So, that's the optimism I have. Even Americans can see that online discourse is not peachy and rosy and great. The pessimism I have is that, of course, once everything becomes partisan and politicized, even terms like disinformation and misinformation, which are real things, can be turned on their head and thrown back and used as political slogans. That's what we're seeing in the United States right now. I hope Canada will take a saner route towards regulating online speech, as every society needs to do.
For the individual, because people listen to this and a lot of them will think, What can I do with it? How can I make a difference in this? Right? They're not in Congress. They're not writing new laws. They're not writing amendments.
Yeah.
I have been, as a journalist who's lived in a certain time, I've been trained to expose myself to all of the opposing views I can find, because it gives me, it has always felt like triangulation of facts and information, and it's good to know what everybody is thinking about everything. Now, I will say some of those sources of information contain misinformation on a regular basis.
Absolutely.
And so just as an individual, I don't know, Farah, if I should keep first of all, I'm giving money to that corporation by consuming their product. And second of all, my brain is receiving misinformation. And as much as I can say that's misinformation, file it over here. Brains are complex animals. Should I keep doing that? Do we keep, because if I don't, the alternative is with the silo effect writ large, and I just stick over here with the things I think are right, and I stop exposing myself to new ideas, and that surely is not the right path.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean,
there's a question in there, but it's a plea for help.
It's a plea for help. I mean, I do think it's very, very, very important to mainly imbibe news from trusted, verified sources that you believe to be authoritative, but you also understand why they're authoritative. The New York Times fact-checks everything. The Financial Times fact-checks everything. Steve Bannon and Alex Jones and Joe Rogan are completely different beasts. They are just bullshitting their way to profit, and doing so under the guise of, we're just keeping an open mind and trying to, and that's how I'm afraid a lot of misinformation, sometimes dangerous, sometimes trivial, spreads in the world. So, I mean, the gamification of our online world and everything being in entertainment and amusement doesn't help. And of course, the silo effect is dangerous. But like you say, we are not, as human beings, we don't have an intrinsic capacity to see the truth. And that's the fallacy that, free speech absolutism thrives on and then causes chaos with. We don't have that capacity. We need to trust other institutions. Whether we're buying food or getting a vaccine or getting a medical checkup, the same is true for truth. So by all means, find out what, crazy things are out there. But I would keep your sanity by recognizing why certain sources are trustworthy and distrusting anything that doesn't have that kind of level of depth and care and time behind it. Come back to it, truth takes time. Fast stuff is often not the best stuff.
I want to finish with what's true right now in the world is that those places we've talked about, academia and science, are two places where we can see the examples, are being undermined for political reasons. That the veracity of the information that surfaces in those places are being undermined. And unfortunately, you weaponize the very ambiguity that those learned places, both academics and scientists, always leave room for the possibility that they're wrong, and it's used against them now. Is it possible that we move past this time, and those are actually two places that are our source of a path forward? In other words, people come to rely on them because there are rules, because they're clear. Well, those would be two places we should lean into, where we're still safe from rampant misinformation. And that might actually be our guide for how we might apply this elsewhere.
I mean, I think so, but I wouldn't put it so strictly as in holding these institutions up to be, the only two places where people can collectively discuss things in good faith, use evidence, advance the truth collectively. I mean, people can do that in their neighborhoods talking about politics. I mean, what you need is good sources of information. So journalism and news gathering and local news, and as well as national news, these are all vitally important. None of us can work as a society without that. That's why the attacks on news gathering and journalism, what people now call disdainfully legacy media, is so dangerous. And I'd also say, and academics would be the first to say this, and you implied that, academic life is just as full of social biases and political biases as the rest of the world. The truths that we laboriously advance in universities are always contingent. They're not the whole truth, they're not the final truth, but that doesn't mean it's okay just to disregard them completely or to falsify them or just to, dismiss them as politicians love to do, especially on the right. So yeah, we have something that's very precious, and we need to hold on to that. And the more people can replicate those, it's the best we have. This is what human beings over centuries have created as their best possible, still fallible, but best possible mechanisms for establishing and advancing the truth. And if we can replicate that in other spheres of life, we'll be better off as a society.
We have to leave it there, Farah. It's great to talk to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Amanda. I really enjoyed it.
We've been talking with Fara Dabhoiwala. Before you go, here are 3 things we think are worth watching this week. Inside Budget 2025 was a move to introduce the first federal framework for a stablecoin in Canada. It's a fiat-backed digital coin that the Bank of Canada would implement. That's part of a bigger move to modernize payments in Canada, which, if you've been paying attention, has been going on for a while. There was a voice of support for the Canada-U.S. trade deal this week from the world's biggest automakers. In a submission to the U.S. Trade Rep about the opening of negotiations, auto firms including GM, Honda, Stellantis, and Volkswagen said moving quickly to re-establish stable trade in North America could unlock billions of new investments. Here's hoping President Trump is listening. And over the next 5 years, 100,000 people in Ontario will be screened for cancer as part of a data gathering exercise at Princess Margaret Cancer Centre. Along with the offering of early detection for cancers, the project creates a massive data set for research that should ultimately also benefit patients. We'll call that a win-win. That's WONK for this week. I'm Amanda Lang. Thanks for being with us.